BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here to talk about Highway into Spain by Marcel Aurousseau. And the title is a little bit deceptive because Highway into Spain is one book, but it's also two books. It was initially published in 1931 in a UK edition in a single volume, but the American edition was published in two separate volumes. Volume 1 is this one here. This is the American edition of Highway into Spain, titled simply Highway into Spain. But Volume 2 was called Beyond the Pyrenees. And I do have that as well. Dust jacket off here, bookmark midway through. But I have so many thoughts about Volume 1 of Highway into Spain that I thought I would break this review up into two videos and film the first part now. I finished reading Volume 1 about a week and a half ago, and I've been slowly working my way through Volume 2, but Volume 1 was just phenomenal. It really is one of those works that should be in print, but is not. If you want to read this book, you're going to have to search online for an older edition, and I wish you luck in finding it, and I wish you many happy hours of reading when you do. But Marcel Aurousseau, not a very well-known name, but he was an excellent writer. And from what I could find online, he was born in Australia at the end of the 19th century. We have a couple of sources online, one of them being a military history site, because he did indeed serve in the Australian military in the First World War. But one of the sources suggests that he was born in Sydney, not the city of Sydney, learning a little bit about Australian geography, but Woollahra, Sydney, Australia, in 1891. He attended a boys' school as a child and ended up working as an assistant professor of geology after he finished his bachelor's degree. And shortly after that, of course, the First World War broke out, and in 1915 he joined the Australian military and ended up serving on the Western Front, where I guess he distinguished himself and received a medal for his service. But after he got out of the military after the end of the Great War, he returned to Australia for a short time and then traveled to America, where he worked for the let me just take a look here. It was either the Geographical or the Geological Society. I've made some notes here because there was just so much, and I'm going to put these into my own personal notes. The American Geological Society. Because when you look him up, of course, he's the author of Highway into Spain, which is kind of a travel memoir, but not quite. But that's not primarily what he's remembered for. He's described as a geographer, a geologist, a war hero, a historian, a translator, and, you know, of course, tack onto that, writer. This work is merely one tiny footnote in his very prolific career in several fields. But so he spent some time in the United States, and that's where he meets Max. And Max is his companion throughout Highway into Spain and Beyond the Pyrenees. And I guess he met Max in the United States. He goes off and he spends some time in London, where he's going to pursue this literary writing career. And at some point, as he describes in the introduction here, he and Max reconnect and they end up in France together. They end up in Paris, where they are sitting together one day, and Max says something along the lines of, "We should do something." And so Aurousseau looks at him and says, "Let us walk to Madrid," which he describes as sort of a lifelong desire of his. He had wanted to take Spanish when he was growing up, but that wasn't really an option, so he ended up studying a different language instead. But he'd had this kind of nugget of a dream in the back of his mind his entire life, that someday he wanted to visit Spain, and not just Spain, but he wanted to visit Madrid. And so that's essentially what this book is. They set out on foot, beginning in Paris, to walk day by day, kilometer by kilometer, until they reach Madrid, Spain. And his background definitely comes into the structure of the book, because it's very focused on terrain, on geographical aspects, but his literary talent shines through too. And so it's not dry, it's not boring. If I hadn't have known that he had a background in geography and geology, I think I could have guessed based on the writing in this book, but I wouldn't, look at it without knowing any of his background and say, this is a dry academic piece. Rather, it's structured in such a way that it's almost soothing to read. And it's very engaging, very interesting to work through this journey. It really is such an immersive work. It's kind of fitted into that travel memoir genre, but even Aurousseau himself says, that's not really what this is. It's more of a narrative, more of a story. It's not meant to be a guide at all for someone looking to take, a similar trip. It's not meant to be a memoir in the traditional sense. And it reads almost like a diary, even though it's retrospective. The detail, the conversations, the things that are grasped onto in each of the chapters reads almost like a diary. And the book itself is structured almost in a correspondence or a letter fashion. He begins by addressing Max, the American that he met, who went on the journey with him. He addresses Max and begins by saying, I'm trying to remember why we decided to take this trip. What exactly was the instigator for this trip? Why did we go? And so he recounts these conversations that led them to it. And he's kind of talking to Max the whole way through, saying, we did this, we went there, this is how you were feeling, this is how I was feeling. And it's almost, a little bit intimate in that way. You can imagine, these two men corresponding, or perhaps, preparing to meet for the first time after many years. And Marcel Aurousseau was saying, remember the last time we were together, remember this trip we took. And even as they travel through some of these towns, Aurousseau, calls on later trips that he took with his father to these same cities and towns, some of these same cities and towns they passed through, and his recollections from later on. And so it's very interesting in that sense, because it's not a traditional memoir. It's a little bit more intimate, a little more epistolary in that regard. And I really do enjoy this passage, which is the instigator for this trip. I'll set aside my beer here, open up the book, and read to you a little passage here. It's on page 2 in the prologue. He begins, "Dear Max," which sets the scene for the whole book. And he says here, which none but the conscientious reader will profitably skip. And so he's sort of warning us to read this because it sets the tone. But he's writing to Max here, and he says, "Do you understand what seemed to be the very first step in this undertaking? Why did you walk to Spain with me? No doubt you have a satisfactory answer when you ask yourself that question, if you do ask it. But it cannot be the whole answer. You remember how simply, spontaneously, unexpectedly the thing began. Winter was over in Paris, and we were sitting at opposite sides of the table, writing in the sunny room of the cottage in the courtyard. Life in Paris had become almost routine, pleasant, satisfying, but monotonous. That is why you did it. We had committed the sin of settling down. You pushed your papers impatiently aside, looked across at me, and said, "A, let us do something." Instantly I responded, "Let us walk to Madrid." Before that moment, there had been no talk of anything so different from what we had been doing. But from that moment, our purpose for the next 3 months was clear. We were going to walk to Madrid. And so they spend a couple of months making preparations. They send, clothing, extras, anything that they won't need or don't want to carry for the journey on their backs. They send ahead by railway to their destination, which is, I don't think you could do it nowadays, because I think nowadays, like, it would get sent back if you didn't collect it soon enough. But they send it ahead, knowing that it's going to be waiting at the railway station, this crate or this box for them when they finally arrive, and they send it off, and they set out on foot, and they take this wonderful journey. And I say wonderful because it's very interesting to read, but it's not the kind of journey that is, inspiring. As I read this, I don't feel inclined to, book train tickets or pack a bag and set out on a day's walk myself, because it is a journey that's very much grounded in reality. There are no rose-colored glasses on this trip. There are blisters, there are bloody feet, there are nights spent at the side of haystacks when accommodations cannot be found. There's a night spent in a barn. There are meals with dried out bread. There is poor food, and there is fatigue. So it's very much grounded in reality, and yet it's hard to put down once you start reading, because you really do kind of hang on every word about this trip, on every description of every village and every person they meet, and every city and every place they stay. And there's almost this, socio-political and social aspect kind of bubbling below the surface throughout the work, because I wouldn't call either Marcel or Max, very politically aware, politically minded. They're not concerned about what's going on in the outside world. They're very concerned on their trip and the individual people they meet. And it's not until they get, to the edge of France and begin to near Spain and actually enter Spain at the end of this volume and into the second volume, Beyond the Pyrenees, that you see that there is, something else going on here apart from their trip. We see indications of what is happening in Spain and what is, about to be happening in Spain. And there's, soldiers, there's military, but they pass them by as everyday occurrences. And there's some references, Spain is not a country that's entirely at peace. And yet they go on with their journey. Some places they go, the people they meet are very distrustful, and probably for good reason, although we don't always know why. As I said, it's not a book, it's not a memoir framed through rose-colored glasses. It's not about, how great and how wonderful this whole experience was. There's a good dose of reality there. But in the midst of all this wonderful description and this narrative and this camaraderie between these two men, there is kind of a subtle philosophy of life coming through. And I think we saw it a bit in that passage I read where Max says, "Let us do something." And it's this idea that to live fully, you need to be doing something. And that, the value, the pleasure in life comes from experiences. And these experiences don't need to cost a lot of money. These experiences don't need to be, in some grand hotel or on some big trip. They don't need to be planned by a travel agent. You don't have to have, a trunk of clothes and a million books with you on your trip. All you really need is yourself and some openness and a willingness to sort of see the beauty in the landscape as you pass through it, and the beauty in the cultures and the people that you're meeting, and a willingness to, even when you face coldness or face rejection from the people you meet along the way, a willingness to still have this, respect for them and the way that they're living, even, as is the case here in some places where they feel, outright unwelcome or outright confused or outright like an outsider. And I think it's because both Marcel, Aurousseau, and Max recognized the whole way through that, as the Australian and the American here, they are the outsider. And for them, even as their, bloody feet, fatigue, bad wine, bad food, there's moments where they're served wine with, gnats and insects that have fallen in and drowned. And yet they drink it because, first of all, they're hungry and thirsty. But second of all, it's part of this living, this experience. And I think it's, quite a beautiful way to look at things. It's kind of an acceptance of what is and finding an enjoyment in those small moments. And I admit it's somewhat curious to me that this book has fallen to the wayside, that it's not actively being reprinted anywhere, because I think it's something that a lot of people today would really enjoy. And I admit I never would have known of its existence if it hadn't been for another now forgotten and obscure author of the 20th century, Lawrence Powell Clark, who talks about Highway into Spain in one of his essay collections. And that's one of the fun parts for me of reading these old and mostly forgotten authors. Having the pleasure to discover wonderful books and wonderful authors, just like Marcel Aurousseau. And, it's equally curious that Highway into Spain, despite being, as far as I could tell in my research, his only literary work, apart from some translations, it's curious that it's not the work that he's remembered for. Rather, he's remembered for a nonfiction work that he wrote, in his field of study. Apparently, his most influential work was something called The Rendering of Geographical Names, that was published in 1957. And his geographical work, in fact, during the Second World War, played a huge part in the Allied war effort. Yeah, during the Second World War, he coordinated military geographical dictionaries that enabled the Allies or helped them to win the war. And so that's quite important. And he was known as a geologist and geographer first. And this kind of literary avenue, literary detour in his life is really secondary in what he's remembered for. And as I said, his only literary work, currently out of print. And so I hope if you enjoyed this discussion that this is something you'll want to look for, to obtain and read yourself. And if you manage to get your hands on a copy, I do hope that you enjoy, many, many good hours of reading with this great book. And I probably will return with a second video once I finish the second volume here. But that aside, I am going to settle in, continue reading, and I hope you have a great evening.